So we have a stub authentication service set up, and now we need to connect to a database. But before we do that, I left a comma out right here in main.go in the authentication service. So let's put that comma there. Now we're going to be connecting to Postgres, so that means we need to get some drivers. And we'll use the ones that are currently the best recommended ones, and that's jackc/pgx. So we need to go get those. So let's go get, and make sure you're in the authentication service folder at the root level. In other words, right beside the go.mod file. Go get from github.com/jackc/pgcon. Okay, so we'll go get that. Then we'll hit the up arrow and backspace to the jackc part and put pgx/v4. And if v5 is out, please stick with v4. It will make things much simpler, okay? And you can upgrade to version 5 later if that's out, but it shouldn't be out for a while. Then hit the up arrow and put /stdlib at the end. And those are our necessary drivers. Okay, so let's close our terminal window and let's connect to the database. Now, connecting to the database is actually pretty simple. What we're going to do is come down here and create a new function, and I'll call this one OpenDB. And it takes a DSN, which is a string. That's the connection string for our database. And we'll get that from the environment, which you'll see momentarily. And it returns a pointer to SQL.db, and it also potentially returns an error. Okay? And we just say db, which is a variable I'm declaring, and error come from SQL.open, and we want to use the type pgx, which we'll have to add to our imports in a moment, and we hand it DSN. Okay, and we check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then we just say return nil and the error. Otherwise, we've connected. So we'll verify that by saying error is now equal to db.ping. We'll try pinging the database. And if we have an error, again, we'll return the same thing. So I'll copy this and paste it here. And return db and nil. Now, you might think that's enough. The problem is we're going to add Postgres to our Docker compose.yml file, and we need to make sure that it's available before we actually return the database connection, because this service might start up before the database does. So what we'll do is we'll create another function here below this one called func connect to db. And it's not going to take any parameters, and it returns a SQL pointer to SQL-db. Okay, here's where we're going to get our DSN. So we'll get that from the environment, and we'll add it to our Docker Compose and so forth before too long. So DSN is assigned the value of os.getOnv, right there, and we're going to look for DSN. Now, I just create an infinite for loop, and I stay in there until I successfully connect to the database. And it's pretty straightforward. So we'll say connection, and potentially an error, come from calling OpenDB and handing it DSN. And then we just check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then I'll say log.println, Postgres not yet ready, ... And I want to do this, but I don't want to do it forever. Let's say that the database crashes, the database refuses to come up for some reason. So I actually want to try this only a certain number of times. So maybe I'll back off for 2 seconds. So what I'll do is I'll create a new variable right at the top, right up here. I'll create a variable called counts, and I'll make it of type int64. Okay? Now back down here in this connect to DB function, or connect to DB function, I'll add one to counts. Counts, try that again, counts ++. So add one to counts. But if there is no error, else, then we actually connect to the database. So I'll say log.println connected to Postgres. And at this point, I just want to return connection. Okay, everything worked. Now, if it didn't work, I don't want to go through this for loop really, really quickly. So instead, I'll say if counts is greater than 10, then I'll print the error, log.println, the error, and I'll just say return nil. And below that, I'll say log.println, backing off for 2 seconds. And then I'll back off for 2 seconds. Time.sleep 2 times time.second. And I'll continue. So now we'll try to connect to the database, but we'll only try for a total of, say, 20 seconds. So we have 10 counts here, and we're waiting for 2 seconds each time, and that should get us connected. Now, if you're on a really slow machine, something that's like 10 or 15 years old, you might want to make this 15 or 20 just to give it time, but this will almost certainly work. Okay, so we have our functionality for connecting to the database. Now, let's actually connect to the database. So we'll get rid of the to-do word here. And right after that comment, I'll say con is assign the value of connect to DB. And we'll say if con is equal to nil, then we don't have a connection. So we'll say log.panic can't connect to Postgres. And we stop at that point, okay? But assuming we get past that, here, now we can say DB in our config is set to con. And models is going to be assigned the value of from the data package we call new, and we hand that our connection to the database. And once we actually set up Postgres, which we'll do in the next lecture, and populate the user table with some information, which we'll also do in the next lecture, this should be up and running. We don't have any roots and we can't do anything yet, but we should be able to start it and connect to the database. So the last thing we have to do before we can actually connect to the database is come up here and put in the necessary imports. So I'll just put them right here. We're going to use the blank identifier because we're not going to directly call this, but we have to have access to it. We're going to import github.com/jackc/pgcon. And we're also going to import github.com/jackc/pgx/v4. And we also need github.com/jackc/pgx/v4/stdlib. Okay, so with all that in place, if we did everything right, we should be able to add Postgres to our Docker Compose to set up an entry for our authentication service and set the appropriate environment variable, DSN, and actually ping the database when this runs. Okay? So let's give this a try in the next lecture.